It began with the sound of milk striking metal, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic, a sound so ordinary that no one in the village yet understood it would summon death. The year was lost somewhere between plagues and famines, in that long 16th century when Europe was half starved and half mad, and belief had become a weapon sharper than any blade. In the valley of fog and frost, a man named Elias awoke before dawn as he always had, his breath steaming in the cold air, his hands trembling from both exhaustion and reverence. He had little in this life, a wife who spoke to him less each year, 2 children whose ribs showed through their shirts, and a single brown cow that had survived the winter when most had perished. The creature was gentle, its eyes wide and dark as river water, and when his hands closed around her teats, the milk came not in trickles but in torrents, as if the earth itself poured through her. It was too much, too thick, too constant, too impossible. And that was where the trouble began. In a village ruled by scarcity, abundance was a crime. When others starved, the one who prospered could only have done so through unholy means. The first to notice was the baker's wife, whose own cow had long gone dry. She crossed herself each morning when Elias passed with his pails, whispering that he must have fed his soul to something dark. Then came the priest, who watched the cows yield with furrowed brow, declaring from the pulpit that Satan's gifts are sweetest when disguised as blessings. Elias tried to laugh it away, but laughter was dangerous in an age that mistook joy for defiance. His wife began to avoid the barn, her prayers longer each night, her eyes darting toward him as if she feared she might find horns beneath his hair. By midsummer, the whispers had hardened into accusation. Milk that never spoiled, they said. Butter that churned too fast. Cheese that melted to the touch. The impossible bounty of one poor farmer became the talk of the market square until it reached the magistrate's ears, an austere man who believed more in God's wrath than his mercy. He summoned the priest, the midwife, and the blacksmith, demanding testimonies, and soon a dossier of superstition was assembled with all the solemnity of Scripture. Elias had once been seen alone at midnight near the barn. The cow had been heard mooing as if in conversation. A light had been glimpsed under the door, pale and flickering. None of it proved anything, but in that century, proof was not required, only coherence, a story that fit the hunger of fear. When the constables arrived, they found Elias in his field, repairing a broken fence. They read aloud the warrant for his arrest: witchcraft, maleficium, and unnatural abundance. He stared at them blankly, unable to comprehend how plenty could be sin. His children clung to him crying, but the guards tore them away. His wife, pale as linen, said nothing. She only crossed herself as they bound his wrists with rope. The cow followed them to the edge of the field, lowing softly, and one of the constables spat that it was the devil's familiar. They took her too. The trial was to be held in the town square 3 days hence. For those 3 days Elias was kept in a cell beneath the church, where dampness crawled down the walls like living skin. The interrogator visited him each morning, a Dominican friar named Father Corvinus, whose eyes were as black as ink, and whose voice carried the practiced gentleness of cruelty. "Confess," he said, "and save your soul." Elias shook his head. "Confess what?" But the friar smiled as though pitying a child. "That you made a pact, that you called upon spirits to bless your beast, that you took what was not yours to take." "It's a cow," Elias whispered. "A cow gives milk, that is all." The friar leaned closer. "And yet it gives more than others. Why?" Elias could not answer, because there was no answer. The silence sealed his fate. That night they tested the milk. Before witnesses, they poured it into a bowl and dropped a silver coin within. When the coin darkened, they claimed it was proof of corruption. When the candlelight trembled across the surface, they said the milk moved with its own will. In that age of delirium, the senses themselves had become accomplices. They said witches could be known by their beasts, that animals were vessels of the unholy, that the devil preferred to hide not in darkness, but in the ordinary. The next morning, they brought Elias to the hall. The villagers had gathered, faces eager and frightened, the air thick with incense and judgment. The magistrate sat beneath a wooden crucifix, the friar beside him. On the table lay a quill, a parchment, and a bucket of the cow's milk gleaming white against the gloom. The charges were read: unnatural fecundity, trafficking with infernal spirits, and the corruption of divine order through animal means. Elias tried to speak, but his voice faltered under the echo of authority. He said he prayed each night, that his cow was a gift, that he had done nothing wrong. The crowd murmured. A woman shouted that her husband's crops had failed after Elias walked past their field. A child cried that the cow's eyes glowed red. A soldier claimed to have heard laughter from the barn at midnight. The magistrate nodded gravely and declared the signs sufficient for examination. That word, examination, was a courtesy, for what it meant was torture. They hung him by his arms until his shoulders cracked. They pressed his legs between boards until the bones screamed through his skin. When he fainted, they revived him with salt water and prayer. The friar whispered psalms while demanding he name his accomplices. He named none. Each refusal became evidence of diabolical resistance. By the third day he could no longer walk, and when they brought him again before the court, he was carried like a sack. His eyes, once bright, had turned inward. The magistrate offered mercy, if he would only admit that he had used unclean charms to bless his cow. At last, in a voice so faint it could barely be heard, Elias said the words they wanted. Yes. The hall exhaled in satisfaction. The confession was written, signed with his trembling hand, and sealed with wax. The friar thanked God for the deliverance of another soul. But Elias, lying there on the floor, knew that he had damned the only creature who had ever trusted him. For once a man confessed, his beast could not be saved. The cow was to be executed too, for the devil could not be half banished. And so, on the morning of his sentencing, the villagers gathered once more, the air thick with the smell of hay and death. They led the cow to the square, her hooves slipping in the mud, her eyes wide with confusion. Elias, chained and half-conscious, was forced to watch. The priest raised the cross. The magistrate recited the verdict, the sentence, both man and beast to burn, that God's order might be restored. The pyre was stacked high, the wood damp from the previous night's rain, hissing as the flames caught. As the fire rose, the cow let out a sound that silenced even the cruelest spectators, a long human moan, as if the world itself mourned its own madness. And through that smoke, Elias saw not judgment, but the face of an age terrified by its own reflection. The flames burned long after Elias's body had fallen still, the smoke rising into the grey sky like a sermon none could understand, curling through the bell tower until the whole valley smelled of ash and milk. When it was over, the magistrate ordered that the remains be buried outside consecrated ground, for though the man had confessed, his guilt was eternal, and eternity was a property the church guarded closely. The villagers went home silent, their boots blackened with soot, each pretending not to have seen the look in the cow's eyes before the end. For weeks afterwards, no milk would curdle properly, no butter would form, no calf would draw breath without trembling. They said the earth had been cursed by what had burned upon it, but still they believed themselves righteous. That was the logic of fear. It forgave itself by naming its victims evil. The priest gave a sermon on the following Sabbath about obedience and divine justice, about how Satan tempted the humble through small acts of fortune. He spoke with conviction, though his voice cracked when he reached the part about temptation. Perhaps even he wondered if the devil had been in the room, not as the accused but as the crowd. Yet questions were dangerous in a century when even a doubt could damn a man. So the village carried on, rebuilding its rituals of suspicion, whispering new names when a harvest looked too good, or a hen laid too often. The world was not cruel because it enjoyed cruelty. It was cruel because it needed order, and order required victims. In the archives of that small court, the trial was recorded in neat Latin, a perfect record of madness disguised as reason. The entry read, "Elias, peasant, found guilty of sorcery through the unnatural increase of a cow, confessed and executed, with said animal burned for complicity. Nothing more. No mention of the screams, the smell, the faces. History, even then, was already sanitizing itself. But elsewhere, beyond parchment and ink, something older had begun to change. The villagers dreamed uneasy dreams. One saw a cow standing in the fields at night, staring through his window with eyes that glowed not red, but sorrowful. Another woke to find milk pooling on her doorstep, thick and cold. A child fell ill after mocking the dead man's name. And soon the priest himself began to wither, his voice rasping during Mass until it broke entirely one winter morning as he tried to bless the bread. He died that week, clutching his crucifix, his mouth full of blood. They buried him beside the church he had guarded, but the rumors spread faster than decay. That the curse of the milkman had returned, that God had sent a warning for the innocent blood spilled. The magistrate dismissed such talk, yet his sleep too grew restless. He dreamed of the trial again and again, only this time he stood in Elias's place, and the friar's voice was his own, accusing him of blasphemy. When spring came, his hair had turned white, though he was not yet 40. He began to drink, to forget, but forgetting was impossible in a world where faith itself kept the memory alive. For belief in witchcraft was not madness, it was structure, a scaffolding for all the terror men could not otherwise explain. The storm, the famine, the plague, the sudden death of a child, all these demanded meaning, and meaning demanded guilt. Thus the cycle continued, one trial feeding another, until the empire of fear became self-sustaining. By the time Elias's name was forgotten, his story had multiplied, repeated in different towns with different faces, but always the same pattern. A cow that gave too much, a woman who healed too well, a man whose fields flourished against the odds. The victims changed, the script did not. In one province, they burned a shepherd whose sheep birthed twin lambs. In another, a widow whose herbs cured a fever the priest's prayers could not. The Inquisition fed on miracles, turning every mercy into evidence, and Europe, drunk on its own righteousness, marched into centuries of purification. The age that had burned Elias was the same that would later burn entire villages, then nations, then continents, each time claiming holiness. The machinery of accusation that had begun with one cow would one day become bureaucracy, theology giving way to ideology, but the logic would remain the same. To maintain order, someone must be sacrificed. In this, Elias was not alone. He was the prototype, the first link in an endless chain of victims needed to preserve a world that could not bear its own reflection. But even in death, he would not vanish. In the following decades, the region suffered strange weather. Floods followed droughts, crops failed inexplicably, and the elders muttered that God had grown silent. It was then that a wandering friar arrived, carrying with him tales from other lands, tales of reform, of men who questioned the church, who said that faith had become tyranny and that reason must speak. His words frightened the villagers more than any spell, for reason was a foreign language to those raised on fear. Yet one young boy listened, the son of a blacksmith who had once testified against Elias. The boy's father had drunk himself to death years earlier, haunted by guilt, and the child grew up with that silence lodged inside him like a splinter. He watched the friar leave and decided that if God's truth could be questioned, perhaps Elias's death could too. But he would never say it aloud. Not yet. In his dreams, he saw the barn burning again, the cow collapsing, the sky split by smoke. Only this time the villagers were faceless, and their prayers were drowned out by the sound of milk striking metal, that soft, rhythmic reminder of all that had been lost. The boy would live to become a chronicler, and in his old age, he would write of that day, not as myth, but as warning. He would call it the season of white fire, the time when men mistook nature's generosity for sin. His manuscript would never be published, buried instead in a monastery's cellar, forgotten like all inconvenient truths. But somewhere in those yellowed pages, between the ink blots and the trembling script, he wrote one line that history would have done well to remember. The devil was not in the milk, nor in the man who drew it, but in the fear that needed to see him burn. Years passed, and the memory of Elias faded like smoke through the rafters of time, absorbed into that great and nameless sorrow that haunted every century. The village where he had lived grew quieter, its population thinned by famine and migration, its church roof sagging under the weight of neglect. Yet beneath that decay, something persisted. A stain in the soil where the pyre had stood, a patch of earth where grass refused to grow. Children avoided it. Old women crossed themselves when passing. And each spring the new priests sprinkled holy water there, as if to remind the dead they had no right to return. But ghosts do not obey boundaries. They travel through silence, through guilt, through memory. And though no spirit ever appeared, the fear remained, humming softly beneath daily life like a wound that would not heal. The age of witch trials was far from over. Across Europe, the machinery of terror grew more sophisticated, its rituals refined, its cruelty codified. Men of learning compiled manuals detailing how to detect witches, how to interrogate, how to extract confession through methods sanctified by scripture. Theology merged with torture until the difference between faith and fear was erased entirely. Scholars debated whether animals could indeed be possessed, whether milk itself could serve as a conduit of evil. Universities issued pamphlets on demonic milk and the corruption of the humors, and learned men argued about how the devil might pervert fertility, how the bounty of nature could mask the chaos of hell. The intellectualization of cruelty gave it permanence, legitimacy, and reach. In one German city, a woman was burned for having hens that laid eggs with double yolks. In another, a farmer's wife was executed because her bees produced honey in winter. The absurdity was systematic, the madness methodical. Each execution promised to restore divine order, and each only deepened the void. The flames that consumed Elias were now consuming continents. But it was not only the accused who suffered. Those who condemned them were not untouched by the fire. In their dreams, inquisitors saw faces melting, beasts crying like infants, milk boiling into blood. One judge in Würzburg wrote in his diary that he no longer knew which side of the cross he stood on. "Every day," he confessed, "I pray that the next trial will bring peace to my soul. Yet with each burning, I feel another part of me turns to ash." His handwriting grew erratic in the final pages, ending mid-sentence as if interrupted by a revelation too terrible to record. And still, the trials went on. In the absence of reason, fear became government. The church, desperate to preserve authority, sanctioned ever more elaborate purges, and the common people, starving, uneducated, and terrified, became both weapon and witness. The mob was theology incarnate, the human form of dogma. In their eyes, Elias's crime had never been that he worshipped Satan. It was that he reminded them of their own helplessness, that he dared to exist outside the boundaries of collective misery. For the masses could forgive sin more easily than they could forgive fortune. A poor man who suffered was pitiable, but a poor man who prospered was an affront to divine order. That paradox poisoned every generation, and so the idea of the witch farmer survived long after the flames had died. By the 17th century, his story had spread across borders, retold in pamphlets, sermons, and tavern songs. He was no longer Elias, but a legend. The herdsman who milked the devil's cow, the sorcerer who fed demons butter, the beastkeeper who cursed a village with plenty. Each retelling made him less human and more symbolic, a vessel for society's dread of the unknown. Yet beneath those distortions, traces of truth lingered, faint but stubborn, like seeds buried in ash. In a forgotten monastery in the Alps, a friar copying legal texts stumbled upon an old parchment, Processus contra agricolam et vacam diabolicam. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded, but the words were unmistakable, the original record of Elias's trial. The friar read it by candlelight, and as he reached the line describing the cow's cry, his hand began to tremble. He closed the book, crossed himself, and whispered that God could not have willed this. For the first time, pity entered the official memory of witchcraft. Quietly, scholars began to question. A physician in Basel argued that overproduction of milk could result from changes in feed, not sorcery. A jurist in Venice wrote that confession under torture was not the voice of truth, but the echo of pain. And though these voices were few and fearful, they marked the beginning of something heretical, the idea that reason might challenge faith's cruelty. But truth in every age advances like a criminal, slowly, cautiously, afraid of being caught. The trials did not end overnight. Whole decades would still pass before Europe learned that mercy was not weakness. In the meantime, thousands burned, tens of thousands screamed confessions into the indifferent wind. The pyres lit up the night like constellations of despair, and for each victim there was an Elias, a cow, a community too afraid to see itself. Somewhere in France, a chronicler recorded a line that could have been written for all of them. We hunted demons until we became them. Yet even that acknowledgement could not undo what had been done. The church repented only in fragments, the state only when convenience demanded it. What remained was silence, that deepest form of guilt. Centuries later, when the Enlightenment arrived like a fevered dawn, philosophers would speak of reason, of human dignity, of progress. They would call the witch trials barbaric, the superstition of dark ages. But the cruelty that killed Elias had only changed its costume. The gallows had become courts, the priests bureaucrats, the flames replaced by ink and decree. The same hunger for purification, for an enemy to blame, endured. And so his story, though buried beneath new languages and ideologies, never truly ended. It merely evolved, shifting form as humanity built new pyres out of paper and laws. For the human heart, once it learns to fear abundance, will always invent a heretic to burn. By the time 2 centuries had passed, Elias's village had changed its name, its church rebuilt with Baroque ornamentation, its people long convinced they had outgrown the old superstition. But history does not vanish, it waits, beneath the cobbled streets, in the soil where the ashes had mingled with roots and rain. Something still pulsed, not ghost, not curse, but memory. That most relentless form of haunting. The Enlightenment had arrived, yet even in its glow the shadow of the pyre lingered. Men of letters spoke of reason and science, of progress and the death of fear. But the hunger for blame had only shifted target. The witch became the heretic became the revolutionary, and soon the prisons were full again, this time not with those accused of sorcery, but of thought. The magistrates' robes had turned into the uniform of bureaucrats, and the cross upon the wall had been replaced by the seal of the state. Yet the ritual was the same. The accusation, the confession, the purification by suffering. The logic of the old trials, rooted in order, in hierarchy, in the terror of the unexplained, lived on, merely clothed in new language. And somewhere in the archives of a provincial university, a historian found a document marked Processus contra agricolam et vacam diabolicam, and though he read Latin fluently, he could not comprehend how learned men could condemn a farmer for milk. He wrote an essay, published quietly, suggesting that witch trials were less about theology and more about fear of change, fear that nature might escape human control. His peers mocked him, saying he was sentimental, yet his idea spread quietly, like an infection. Scholars began to see in the old records a mirror of themselves. For what was knowledge, after all, but another form of power? And what was power but the right to define whose truth was permitted to live? Across Europe, museums began to collect instruments of torture once blessed by priests. The thumbscrews, the branding irons, the inquisitorial chairs. People visited them with the same fascination their ancestors had brought to executions. The past had become spectacle, stripped of its horror, safe behind glass. But glass does not erase reflection. In those exhibits, one could still see the face of the onlooker, distorted, merging with the iron tools. It was as if the centuries themselves were whispering. Nothing has changed. The farmer had burned, the cow had burned, but the impulse that killed them remained eternal. The need to destroy what cannot be understood. And yet, among the ashes of memory, a strange tenderness began to bloom. Artists painted scenes of peasants and animals in pastoral calm. Poets wrote of innocence lost to ignorance, philosophers of the cruelty of collective virtue. A quiet rebellion against certainty took root. In a remote corner of the same region where Elias once lived, a schoolteacher told his pupils about the witch trials, not as divine justice, but as human tragedy. He told them of the farmer whose cow gave too much milk, of how envy turned faith into execution, of how the pious became murderers in the name of purity. The children listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes, though they could not grasp why a world could fear something as harmless as a cow. The teacher ended his lesson with a single sentence: "Never mistake righteousness for goodness." He lost his position soon after. The priest said his words encouraged doubt, but the idea had already taken root. Years later, one of those children, now grown into a writer, would retell the story again in a time of new tyrannies, when trains carried the condemned not to pyres, but to camps, when science served dogma as a once religion had. And as he wrote, he realized that Elias was not only a man, but a warning, a prophecy unheeded. He saw in the farmer's quiet endurance the image of every victim crushed by collective belief. The cow became symbol, the milk metaphor, abundance itself the unforgivable sin. Because history, when stripped of names, always repeats its grammar. In each era, there is a moment when compassion becomes subversion, when to question punishment becomes a crime. And so the flames return, altered but familiar. They burn now in words, in rumors, in silence. The village that killed Elias has become the world. Its language is progress, its priests are leaders, its trials are public opinion, and its pyres are invisible. But the heat is the same. There are still men who fear the unexplainable, still crowds who demand purification, still systems that require someone to blame. In the face of this, the story of the farmer is not past, but prophecy, its echo stretching across centuries like the lowing of a forgotten cow. And if one listens closely in the stillness of early morning, when frost clings to the grass and the first drop of milk strikes the pail, it is possible to hear it still, the sound of innocence turned into evidence, of nature made guilty by its own generosity. Centuries later, the world had changed beyond recognition, yet beneath the polished surface of modernity, the same primitive pulse endured. The city lights had replaced the candles of the chapel. The language of miracles had given way to the language of science. But the fear of what exceeded human control still ruled quietly beneath the skin of civilization. No one burned cows anymore. No inquisitors in black robes stalked the countryside. But the machinery of suspicion had simply refined itself. Men no longer spoke of demons. They spoke of contagion, impurity, ideology, bloodlines, and corruption of the state. The vocabulary changed. The violence remained. The same architecture of accusation persisted, one victim to heal the fear of the many. In a museum of rural history, a young historian stood before a display titled "The Age of Witchcraft," where a small rusted plaque read, "Trial of a Farmer and His Cow, 1587. The description was brief, clinical, drained of agony. It spoke of economic tension, moral panic, environmental stress. It mentioned neither the cries nor the smell of burning milk. The historian stared at the relics, iron shackles, fragments of parchment, the faint outline of a hoof branded with a cross, and wondered how humanity could turn murder into exhibit, horror into heritage. But that was what history always did. It embalmed guilt until it could be admired without shame. Outside, tourists passed through the village unaware of the ground they walked upon, where once an innocent man and a creature of innocence had been destroyed for daring to exist too fully. The church had been rebuilt, its crucifix shining above the square, its bells ringing as they always had, their tones erasing the memory of their former audience. Time had turned superstition into folklore, atrocity into lesson, but no repentance into wisdom, because repentance requires transformation, and transformation is the one miracle humanity refuses to perform. The historian left the museum that evening and walked to the edge of the fields, where mist still rose in low silver sheets across the grass. There, where no monument marked the place, he felt the weight of invisible graves. He imagined Elias standing among the smoke, the cow trembling beside him, the crowd's faces gleaming with that terrible light of conviction, the ecstasy of the righteous watching another burn. And he understood suddenly that this ecstasy had never vanished. It had only changed its disguise. It lived in every society that punished difference, every system that demanded purity, every age that called cruelty necessity. He saw the pattern repeating endlessly, from bonfires to firing squads to digital shaming, every generation building its own pyre, always claiming to defend the sacred, always too afraid to look at what it destroyed. Somewhere, a child was still being taught that good people never question authority, that obedience is virtue. Somewhere, a judge was still believing that order must come before mercy. Somewhere, a crowd was still whispering about the neighbor who had too much when others had too little. And somewhere, deep in the unconscious of civilization, the fire still burned, hungry for the next offering. The historian knelt, pressing his hand into the earth. It was cold, but not lifeless. He thought of the milk, the impossible, luminous milk that had once poured like grace into a world too starved to recognize it. He thought of the cow's eyes, of the man's silence, of the crowd's relief when the flames rose. And for the first time, he felt not anger, not even sorrow, but awe. A terrible awe for the capacity of human beings to destroy what they most need, to fear what might save them. As he stood, the fog thickened, swallowing the fields in white. For an instant, he imagined he heard the sound of hooves, the low rhythm of breathing, the faint metallic drip of milk hitting an unseen pail. The sound grew softer, then vanished into the mist, leaving only the echo of what history refuses to forget. Because beneath every progress, beneath every law and prayer and creed, there is still that ancient terror, that to live abundantly, to thrive when others suffer, to be touched by something unearned, is to invite annihilation. The farmer had not been killed by faith, but by envy sanctified, by hunger masquerading as holiness. And that hunger was eternal. The fire that consumed him did not end with him. It moved from age to age, changing form, seeking new fuel. And perhaps in the end, that was what it meant to be human. To live in the brief, fragile space between miracle and fear, to draw sustenance from the same hand that might one day strike. The historian walked back through the fog, and as he reached the edge of the village, the church bell began to ring again, its tone indistinguishable from the iron clatter of the past. Somewhere beyond the veil of centuries, Elias's story remained unfinished, not because it lacked an ending, but because humanity never learned from it. Every time a society condemns the inexplicable, every time it punishes what it cannot understand, the farmer burns again, the cow screams again, and the pail overflows once more with the milk of accusation. And until the world learns to forgive abundance, until it learns to bless the inexplicable rather than destroy it, the pyre will always wait, patient, righteous, and ready.